The scorching Nevada sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty trail as Jake Morrison urged his weary horse forward. His throat parched and his water canteen bone dry. 3 days had passed since he'd fled Silver Creek with a bounty on his head, accused of a murder he didn't commit. The sheriff's posse had given up the chase yesterday, but Jake knew they'd be back with reinforcements. His only hope lay in crossing the treacherous Mojave Desert and reaching the California border. But his horse was faltering and the nearest town was still 50 miles away. As the afternoon heat shimmered off the sand dunes, Jake spotted something that made his heart race with desperate hope, a thin column of smoke rising from behind a rocky outcropping. Where there was smoke, there was fire, and where there was fire, there might be water and shelter. Guiding his mount around the massive red sandstone formation, Jake discovered a sight that seemed too good to be true. A modest adobe house sat nestled against the cliff face, its walls weathered but solid, with a small corral containing 2 healthy horses and a well that promised precious water. But what caught his attention most was the woman standing in the doorway, her long black hair catching the desert wind and her dark eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. She was beautiful in a wild, untamed way, wearing a simple cotton dress that had seen better days. But there was something in her gaze that spoke of danger and secrets. "You look like a man running from something," she called out, her voice carrying easily across the desert air despite the distance between them. Jake hesitated, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt .45 at his hip, but his horse chose that moment to stumble, reminding him of his desperate situation. "My horse needs water," he replied, dismounting slowly and keeping his hands visible. "I can pay." The woman laughed, a sound that was both melodic and somehow unsettling. "Money's no good out here, stranger, but I might be willing to make a trade." She stepped aside and gestured toward the well. "Water your horse, then we'll talk." As Jake led his mount to the well and began drawing up the life-giving water, he noticed details about the place that made his skin crawl. The corral fence was reinforced with barbed wire, unusual for keeping horses in but perfect for keeping people out, or perhaps keeping them in. Scattered around the property were personal belongings that clearly didn't belong to a woman living alone. A man's hat here, a pair of boots there, a rifle leaning against the porch that looked like it had seen recent use. Most disturbing of all were the 3 wooden crosses visible on a small hill behind the house, grave markers that looked far too fresh for his comfort. "Name's Elena Vasquez," the woman said, approaching him with a pitcher of cool water and a tin cup. "This here's my place. Been in my family for generations. What brings a man like you to the middle of nowhere?" Jake accepted the water gratefully, draining the cup in one long gulp before answering. "Just passing through, ma'am. Heading to California for work." Elena smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. California's a long way off, and the desert's got a way of claiming men who aren't prepared for her tricks. "You'd be wise to rest here tonight. Start fresh in the morning when it's cooler." The offer was tempting, perhaps too tempting, but Jake's horse was exhausted and the thought of traveling through the desert at night filled him with dread. Wild animals, rattlesnakes, and the constant threat of losing his way in the darkness made Elena's hospitality seem like a godsend, despite his growing unease about the woman and her isolated homestead. "That's mighty kind of you, Miss Vasquez, but I wouldn't want to impose." Elena stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the desert sage in her hair and see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. "You'll sleep in my bed or nowhere," she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The desert don't suffer fools, and a man traveling alone at night is the biggest fool of all." The way she said it sent a chill down Jake's spine despite the oppressive heat. There was something final about her words, as if she was stating a fact rather than making an offer. "I appreciate the kindness, but I've got my bedroll. I can sleep under the stars just fine." Elena's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "The stars won't protect you from the creatures that hunt in the dark, mister." She paused, waiting for him to fill in his name. "Morrison," Jake replied automatically, immediately regretting giving his real name. "Jake Morrison." "Well, Mr. Morrison, I've lived in this desert my whole life, and I'm telling you that no man survives a night in the open without proper shelter. The temperature drops 40 degrees after sundown, And that's when the real predators come out to hunt. Coyotes, mountain lions, and things that are far worse than either. She gestured toward the house with a sweep of her arm. I've got a comfortable bed, hot food, and walls that'll keep the night terrors at bay. All I ask in return is some company and conversation. It gets mighty lonely out here. Jake found himself studying Elena's face more carefully, searching for signs of deception or hidden motives. She was older than he'd first thought, probably in her early 30s, with fine lines around her eyes that spoke of years squinting against the desert sun. Her hands were calloused and strong, the hands of someone accustomed to hard work and harder living. But there was something else about her, an aura of barely contained wildness that reminded him of a cornered wolf, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. Those graves on the hill, Jake said, nodding toward the wooden crosses. Family? Elena's smile faltered for just a moment before returning, but Jake caught the brief flash of something dark in her eyes. Travelers like yourself. Men who thought they could conquer the desert and learned too late that she always wins in the end. I bury them proper, say a few words over their bones. It's the Christian thing to do. The explanation should have been reassuring, but something about the way she delivered it made Jake's blood run cold. Mighty coincidental that 3 men all died near your place. The desert's full of bones, Mr. Morrison. I just happen to live in a spot where the foolish and unprepared tend to meet their end. Some folks call it cursed land, but I prefer to think of it as honest. The desert doesn't lie or make false promises. She shows you exactly what you're made of, and most men don't like what they see. Elena turned and walked toward the house, her hips swaying hypnotically. Supper's almost ready. Salt pork and beans with fresh bread. When's the last time you had a home-cooked meal? Jake's stomach growled at the mention of food, reminding him that he'd been living on hardtack and jerky for the past 3 days. The aroma drifting from the house was heavenly, rich and savory, and nothing like the trail rations he'd been choking down. Against his better judgment, he found himself following Elena toward the adobe structure, leading his horse to the small stable attached to the side of the building. Inside, he discovered 2 other horses, both in excellent condition and bearing expensive saddles that looked out of place in such a remote location. Nice animals, Jake commented, running his hand along the flank of a beautiful Palomino mare. Don't see many horses this well-bred in the middle of nowhere. Elena paused in the doorway, her back still turned to him. Gifts from grateful travelers. Sometimes men pay their debts in livestock instead of coin. Her explanation was plausible, but Jake noticed that one of the saddles still had personal belongings tied to it, a bedroll, saddlebags, and a rifle scabbard that looked like they'd been abandoned recently rather than given as payment. The interior of Elena's house was surprisingly comfortable and well-appointed for such a remote location. Hand-carved furniture filled the main room, along with colorful woven rugs and pottery that spoke of Mexican craftsmanship. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, and shelves lined with books and various curious objects covered another. What caught Jake's attention most were the photographs displayed on a small table near the window, images of Elena with various men, all of them smiling and relaxed, all of them looking like they'd been taken right here at the house. You entertain a lot of visitors, Jake observed, picking up one of the photographs. The man in the picture was tall and well-dressed, with the look of a successful businessman or perhaps a professional gambler. Elena glanced over from where she was stirring a pot at the stove. That's Mr. Blackwood from San Francisco. He stayed here for nearly a week last month, recovering from a bad fall. Lovely man, very generous with his stories and his coin. Jake studied the photograph more carefully. The man looked healthy and happy, not like someone recovering from an injury. Where is he now? Jake asked, setting the photograph back down. Elena's stirring grew more vigorous, and she didn't look up when she answered. Continued on to Los Angeles, I believe. Said he had business there that couldn't wait. Something about her tone made Jake uncomfortable, but before he could pursue the matter further, Elena announced that supper was ready and began ladling generous portions of stew into 2 wooden bowls. The meal was delicious, better than anything Jake had eaten in months, and he found himself relaxing despite his earlier concerns. Elena was an engaging conversationalist, asking about his travels and sharing stories of life in the desert that were both fascinating and slightly disturbing. She spoke of sandstorms that could strip the flesh from a man's bones, of desert spirits that led travelers astray, and of the strange things that happened when the moon was dark and the coyotes sang their ancient songs. "You believe in such things?" Jake asked, helping himself to another slice of Elena's excellent cornbread. "Spirits and supernatural nonsense?" Elena fixed him with that unsettling stare again. "I believe the desert has power that civilized folks can't understand. I've seen men go mad from thirst and start talking to people who weren't there. I've watched rattlesnakes dance in circles under the full moon. I've heard voices calling from the empty places where no human throat could make such sounds. You spend enough time alone out here, and you learn that there's more to this world than what they teach in church." As the evening wore on, Jake found himself growing drowsy despite his attempts to stay alert. The combination of exhaustion, a full belly, and the hypnotic sound of Elena's voice was making it difficult to keep his eyes open. "Maybe I should check on my horse," he said, starting to rise from his chair. Elena's hand shot out and grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. "The horse is fine. He's got food, water, and shelter. More than most creatures can say in this wasteland." Her grip was firm, almost painful, and Jake noticed that her fingernails were longer and sharper than they'd appeared earlier. "I really should be getting some rest," Jake said, gently but firmly pulling his hand free. "Early start tomorrow and all." Elena smiled, but there was something predatory about the expression. "Of course, the bedroom's through that door. I've already turned down the covers for you." She gestured toward a doorway covered by a heavy curtain. "Sweet dreams, Mr. Morrison. I have a feeling you're going to sleep very deeply tonight." The bedroom was small but comfortable, with a large bed covered in soft quilts and a small window that looked out over the desert. Jake noticed that the window had bars on it, ostensibly to keep intruders out, but they looked more like they were designed to keep someone in. The door had a heavy wooden bar that could be dropped into place, but only from the outside. These details should have alarmed him, but the strange drowsiness was getting worse, making it hard to think clearly. Jake sat down on the edge of the bed and pulled off his boots, fighting to stay conscious long enough to make sense of what was happening to him. The food, he realized with growing horror, Elena had drugged the food. That explained the overwhelming fatigue, the way his thoughts seemed to move through thick honey, the increasing difficulty he was having coordinating his movements. He tried to stand, to reach for his gun, but his legs wouldn't support him and his hand felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Through the haze of whatever Elena had given him, Jake heard movement in the main room, the sound of furniture being moved and what might have been the clink of metal tools. Fighting against the drug with every ounce of willpower he possessed, Jake managed to crawl to the small window and peer out into the desert night. What he saw made his blood freeze despite the narcotic coursing through his veins. Elena was digging a hole near the 3 wooden crosses, her movements efficient and practiced, like she'd done this many times before. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The travelers' belongings scattered around the property, the expensive horses in the stable, the photographs of men who'd never made it to their destinations. Elena wasn't a desert hermit offering hospitality to weary travelers. She was a predator, a black widow spider in human form who lured men to their deaths in this godforsaken place. And now he was going to join the collection of bones buried beneath those wooden crosses unless he could find a way to overcome the drug and escape. Jake bit down hard on his tongue, using the sharp pain to fight off the encroaching unconsciousness. The metallic taste of blood filled his mouth, but it helped clear his head enough to form a plan. His gun was still in its holster, and Elena probably thought he was too drugged to be dangerous. If he could stay conscious long enough for her to come back inside, he might be able to turn the tables on her. The key was making her think the drug had completely incapacitated him. Forcing his uncooperative limbs to move, Jake arranged himself on the bed in what he hoped looked like an unconscious position. His breathing slow and deep, his gun hand positioned where he could draw quickly if necessary. Through the small window, he could see Elena finishing her grisly work, wiping sweat from her brow as she completed the grave that was meant to be his final resting place. She was stronger than she looked, handling the shovel with the ease of long practice. The sound of Elena's footsteps approaching the bedroom made Jake's heart race, but he forced himself to remain motionless, his breathing regular and deep. The curtain was pulled aside, and he could sense her standing in the doorway, studying him in the darkness. "Sleep tight, handsome," she whispered, her voice carrying a note of genuine affection that made the situation even more disturbing. "Don't worry. It'll all be over soon, and then you can rest forever in my beautiful desert." Elena moved closer to the bed, and Jake could smell the desert sage in her hair, mixed with the earthy scent of freshly turned soil. She leaned over him, her breath warm against his face, as she checked to make sure he was truly unconscious. This was his chance, possibly his only chance, but the drug was making his movements sluggish and uncoordinated. When he tried to grab for his gun, his hand moved with agonizing slowness, giving Elena time to react. Well, she said, stepping back just out of reach. "Looks like someone's got more fight in him than I expected." "That's all right, sugar. I like a little spirit in my men. Makes the game more interesting." Her voice had changed, losing the warm hospitality and revealing something cold and dangerous underneath. "You can't fight the desert lily forever, though. That little herb's been putting men to sleep permanently for more years than I care to count." Jake managed to get his feet under him, swaying dangerously as he tried to draw his weapon. Elena laughed, a sound like wind through broken glass. "Go ahead, try it. See if those fingers still work the way they used to." His gun felt impossibly heavy, and when he finally managed to clear leather, his aim was so shaky, he couldn't have hit the broadside of a barn. Elena watched his struggles with amusement, like a cat toying with a wounded mouse. "You know what your problem is, Mr. Morrison?" Elena asked, circling him like a predator. "You're too trusting. A woman offers you food and shelter, and you just accept it without question. Didn't your mama ever tell you not to take candy from strangers?" She produced a wicked-looking knife from somewhere in the folds of her dress, its blade gleaming in the moonlight streaming through the barred window. Jake lunged toward the door, but Elena was faster, blocking his path with fluid grace. "Now where do you think you're going? The party's just getting started." She slashed at him with the knife, and only his desperate backward stumble saved him from having his throat opened. The blade whistled through the air where his neck had been a split second before, and Jake realized that Elena wasn't just a poisoner. She was also skilled with edged weapons. "Please," Jake gasped, his tongue thick and his words slurred from the drug. "I never did nothing to you. Just let me go, and I'll never say nothing to nobody about this place." Elena's laughter was genuinely delighted. "Oh, honey, they all say that. Every last one of them. They promise me the moon and the stars if I'll just let them walk away. But here's the thing about promises. They're easy to make and even easier to break." Fighting off waves of dizziness, Jake tried to keep the bed between himself and Elena, using the furniture to slow her advances. "Why?" he managed to ask. "Why do this to innocent people?" Elena's expression grew thoughtful, as if she was genuinely considering his question. "Innocent? Sugar. There ain't no innocent men riding alone through the desert with guns on their hips and worry in their eyes. Every man who comes to my door is running from something, and most of them deserve whatever's chasing them." "What about the law?" Jake asked, still trying to buy time for the drug to wear off. "Someone's going to come looking for all these missing men eventually." Elena shrugged eloquently. "The desert's a big place, and men disappear out here all the time. Thirst, exposure, wild animals, accidents. There's 100 ways to die in this country, and most of them don't leave enough evidence for any questions to be asked." Jake's vision was starting to clear slightly, and he noticed something he'd missed before in his drugged state. Elena was breathing hard, and there was a sheen of perspiration on her forehead that hadn't been there when she'd first appeared with the knife. The desert lily, whatever that was, might be affecting her too, or perhaps she'd been exposed to it so many times that it was taking a toll on her system. It was a slim hope, but it was all he had. "You don't look so good yourself," Jake observed, trying to sound more coherent than he felt. "That poison working both ways?" Elena's smile faltered for just a moment, confirming his suspicion. "I built up a tolerance years ago. Takes more than a little desert lily to put me down. But her voice lacked its earlier confidence, and Jake noticed that her knife hand was beginning to tremble slightly. Using every ounce of determination he possessed, Jake feinted left and then dove right, rolling across the bed and coming up on the other side of the room. Elena's reflexes were definitely slower than they had been, and she stumbled slightly as she tried to follow his movement. The knife slashed through empty air, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Jake felt a flicker of hope. "Getting tired, Elena?" Jake taunted, backing toward the curtained doorway. "Maybe you should have used a smaller dose. Kept yourself sharper for the finishing work." Elena snarled and lunged at him again, but her coordination was definitely deteriorating. The knife caught in the bed quilts as she tried to pull it free for another strike, giving Jake the opening he desperately needed. He grabbed Elena's wrist with both hands, using his superior size and strength to force the knife away from his body. They struggled desperately, crashing into furniture and knocking over Elena's carefully arranged photographs. The images of her previous victims scattered across the floor, their smiling faces seeming to mock the deadly game being played out above them. "You're going to join them," Elena hissed, trying to drive her knee into Jake's groin. "Every last one of them thought they were smarter than me, stronger than me. But the desert always wins in the end, and I am the desert." Her strength was fading, though, and Jake could feel the balance of power shifting in his favor as the drug gradually worked its way out of his system. With a final surge of effort, Jake twisted Elena's wrist until she cried out and dropped the knife. The weapon clattered across the wooden floor, spinning to a stop near the far wall. Elena tried to break free and run for it, but Jake's grip on her wrist held firm. "Now we're going to have ourselves a different kind of conversation," he said, his voice regaining some of its normal strength and authority. "You can't prove nothing," Elena spat, still fighting against his hold. "It's your word against mine. And who's going to believe a drifter over a respectable woman living alone in the desert?" Jake looked around the room at the scattered photographs, the personal belongings that clearly didn't belong to Elena, and the knife that had been intended for his heart. "I think the evidence speaks pretty loud for itself." But even as Jake felt relief at having turned the tables on his would-be murderer, he realized that his troubles were far from over. He was still dozens of miles from the nearest town, still had a bounty on his head for a crime he didn't commit, and still had to figure out what to do with Elena and the grisly evidence of her crimes. The desert might have revealed her true nature, but it hadn't made his own situation any less desperate. "What now?" Elena asked, her earlier bravado replaced by genuine fear. "You going to kill me? Leave me for the buzzards like I was planning to do to you?" Jake considered his options carefully. Taking Elena to the authorities would mean exposing himself to arrest for the murder charge he was fleeing. Leaving her alive meant she could continue preying on other travelers. But killing her in cold blood wasn't something he could live with, no matter what she'd done. "We're going to ride to the nearest town together," Jake decided. "You're going to confess to the sheriff what you've been doing out here, and in return, I won't leave you tied to a cactus for the desert to claim." Elena's eyes narrowed as she calculated her chances. "And what's to stop me from telling that same sheriff about the bounty on your head? Jake Morrison wanted for murder in Silver Creek. I'm sure they'd be very interested to know you're in their territory." The standoff stretched between them as Jake weighed his options. Elena was right that turning her in would likely result in his own capture, but leaving her free to continue her murderous activities wasn't acceptable either. "Maybe there's a third option," he said slowly. "Maybe we both disappear into this desert and never bother civilized folks again." "What do you mean?" Elena asked, suspicion evident in her voice. Jake gestured toward the barred window and the vast emptiness beyond. "This is your kingdom, right? Your domain where the desert rules and civilized law don't reach. Maybe it's time for both of us to embrace that completely. You stop killing innocent travelers, and I stop running from a crime I didn't commit. We make our own law out here." Elena studied his face in the dim light, searching for signs of deception or hidden motives. "You'd stay here? With me? After everything that's happened tonight?" Jake nodded slowly. "The way I see it, we're both prisoners of this desert in our own ways. You because you've made it your hunting ground, Me because it's the only place I'm safe from the law. Maybe it's time we stopped fighting each other and started fighting the real enemy. Which is? Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake looked out the window at the 3 wooden crosses silhouetted against the star-filled sky. Loneliness. Desperation. The kind of isolation that drives people to do terrible things just to feel connected to something. Anything, even if it's death itself. He released her wrist and stepped back, his hands raised peacefully. I'm proposing a partnership, Elena. A chance for both of us to find something better than what we've been living with. The proposal hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire, fragile and easily dispersed by the slightest wrong word or movement. Elena rubbed her wrist where Jake had held her, considering his words with the careful attention of someone who'd spent years surviving by reading people's true intentions. You really think we could make it work? 2 broken people in a broken place. I think the desert's got room for all kinds of brokenness, Jake replied. Question is whether we want to keep being broken alone, or try being broken together and see if that makes us stronger. He gestured toward the main room. Those men in the photographs, they came here looking for something, same as I did. Maybe what they needed wasn't what you gave them, but it wasn't what they were running toward either. Elena walked to where the photographs lay scattered on the floor and began picking them up one by one. They were all running from something, she said quietly. Debt, divorce, crimes they'd committed or been accused of committing. The desert draws men like that, men who've got nowhere else to go. She held up the picture of Mr. Blackwood. This one was running from creditors in San Francisco. Lost everything in a bad business deal and couldn't face going home to his family. What happened to him? Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Elena's shoulders sagged as if a great weight had settled on them. Same thing that happened to all of them. I gave them what I thought they wanted, a permanent escape from their troubles. Seemed like mercy at the time, but looking back now, maybe I was just too afraid of being alone to let anyone leave. Jake moved closer, careful not to seem threatening. It doesn't have to be that way anymore. We could help people instead of hurting them. Give them food, water, directions, a safe place to rest before continuing their journey. Turn this place into a genuine sanctuary instead of a trap. Elena looked up at him with tears in her eyes. You'd really stay? Even knowing what I've done? I've done things I'm not proud of too, Jake admitted. Maybe not the same things, but I've got blood on my hands and guilt in my heart. The difference is you've got a chance to choose a different path now. We both do. He extended his hand toward her. What do you say, Elena? Partners in redemption instead of partners in crime. Elena stared at his outstretched hand for a long moment, then slowly reached out and took it. Her grip was firm and warm, nothing like the predatory touch he'd experienced earlier. All right, Jake Morrison. Let's see if 2 lost souls can find their way together in this godforsaken place. She squeezed his hand gently. But I've got one condition. Those graves out there, they deserve better than wooden crosses and unmarked holes in the ground. If we're really going to start over, we need to make amends for what came before. Jake nodded solemnly. We'll give them proper burials, with real headstones if we can manage it. And we'll find a way to get word to their families about what happened to them. Even if we can't tell the whole truth. Elena wiped her eyes with her free hand. There's a mason in Barstow who owes me a favor. He could make proper markers, no questions asked. As dawn broke over the Mojave Desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to promise new beginnings, Jake and Elena stood together beside the 3 wooden crosses. The events of the night seemed like a fevered dream in the clean morning light, but the evidence of Elena's crimes remained stark and undeniable. It's going to be a long road, Elena said, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty. Changing the habits of a lifetime, learning to live without the fear and anger that's driven me for so long. Long roads are easier when you've got company for the journey, Jake replied, putting his arm around her shoulders in a gesture of comfort rather than possession. And this desert's taught us both that survival depends on adaptation. We'll figure it out as we go. Elena leaned into his embrace, and for the first time in years, she felt something other than the cold satisfaction of a successful hunt. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last shadows of night and illuminating the harsh beauty of the desert landscape that had been both sanctuary and prison for them both. In the distance, heat mirages began their daily dance, creating the illusion of water where none existed. But Jake and Elena had learned to see past such deceptions. They had found something real in each other, something that might just be worth the risk of trusting again. Their story would become legend in the scattered settlements of the Mojave, whispered around campfires and repeated in saloons from Death Valley to the Colorado River. Some versions painted Elena as a reformed murderess who found salvation in the arms of a wronged man. Others described Jake as a fugitive who tamed a desert demon through courage and compassion. But those who knew the truth understood that redemption is rarely that simple or that dramatic. The reality was far more mundane and far more miraculous. Two damaged people had found each other in the vastness of the American West and chosen to build something better than what they'd been before. They would face challenges, setbacks, moments of doubt and despair, but they would face them together. And in a land where survival often meant becoming something less than human, Jake Morrison and Elena Vasquez had somehow managed to become something more.